1945, the Allied forces stood over the ruins of the Third Reich and told the world that evil had been defeated. The formal proceedings at Nuremberg, the photographs of the aftermath, the signed surrenders. History recorded all of it, and history was not lying. But history was also not telling you everything. Because while the cameras were still rolling at those proceedings, while the verdicts were being read aloud, a different operation was already underway. Quietly, deliberately, with the full knowledge of men who had just finished presiding over formal post-war accountability. The United States government, specifically its nascent intelligence apparatus, which would soon become the CIA, was in the process of recruiting, sheltering, and paying former officers of the Third Reich's most feared intelligence service. Not by accident. Not as a temporary measure. As a deliberate, long-term strategic decision. The man at the center of it had served Adolf Hitler faithfully for over a decade. His name was Reinhard Gehlen. And by 1946, he was working for the Americans. This is not a theory. Every major detail in this story has been confirmed by declassified U.S. government documents, congressional investigations, and the CIA's own historical records. The question was never whether it happened. The question is why, and what it cost. To understand what happened after the war, you need to understand what Reinhard Gehlen did during it. Gehlen was a general in the Wehrmacht. But his specific role was as head of Fremdheerost, Foreign Armies East. In plain terms, he ran intelligence operations against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. For years, his office built one of the most extensive human intelligence networks ever assembled against a single adversary, thousands of informants, agents, and operatives embedded across Eastern Europe and inside the Soviet sphere. He was extraordinarily good at it. By early 1945, Gehlen could read the trajectory of the war. Germany was finished. And Gehlen made a calculated decision that would define the next 2 decades of Western intelligence. He had his team microfilm their entire archive of Soviet intelligence, everything. Order of battle. Agent networks. Assessments of Soviet military capacity and political structure. He buried the files in waterproof containers in the Austrian Alps. Then he surrendered, not randomly, but specifically to American forces. He wanted to negotiate. And he had leverage. When U.S. Army intelligence officers sat across from Gehlen in the summer of 1945, they were looking at a man who possessed something the Americans desperately needed and did not yet have: deep, operational knowledge of the Soviet Union. The Cold War had not yet been named. But the tensions were already visible. And the Americans had almost no intelligence infrastructure in Eastern Europe. Gehlen offered them everything: his files, his methodology, and crucially, his surviving network of agents, in exchange for his personal safety, the protection of his officers, and eventually, American funding to rebuild his operation. The Americans said yes. General Walter Bedell Smith, who would later become director of the CIA, described the arrangement in Internal Communications as a practical necessity. The U.S. simply could not afford to build from zero. Gehlen was, in the cold calculation of early Cold War strategy, too valuable to set aside. What no one fully confronted at the time, or what was confronted and dismissed, was the documented wartime conduct of Gehlen's people. Because Fremdheerost had not only gathered intelligence, It had operated in close coordination with units responsible for some of the most severe documented incidents on the Eastern Front. That detail did not stop the deal. It was noted and set aside. By 1946, what had begun as an informal arrangement was formalized into something that would become known as the Gehlen Organization, Die Organisation Gehlen, and it operated openly as a U.S.-funded intelligence unit based in Pulich, Bavaria. Gehlen rebuilt his old networks. He recruited his former officers. He drew a salary, in effect, from U.S. military intelligence budgets. The Americans called it Operation Rusty in its early phase. The operation ran for nearly a decade before it was handed over, in 1956, to the newly formed West German government, at which point it became the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, which still exists today as Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. For years, U.S. intelligence officials maintained that Gehlen's people were vetted, that officers with serious wartime records were excluded, that the arrangement was carefully managed. Declassified documents suggest a more complicated reality. A 2001 U.S. government report, produced under the Nazi War Records Disclosure Act Working Group, examined thousands of pages of previously classified CIA files. What the report confirmed was significant. The Gehlen Organization did employ individuals with serious wartime histories. Some had served in units with documented involvement in large-scale operations against civilian populations in Eastern Europe. The CIA was aware of wartime records in some cases. The question of how aware, and at what level, remains partially contested by historians. What is not contested, the operational logic that drove the arrangement. The Soviet threat was real. The intelligence gap was real. And the Americans made a decision that, by their own internal reasoning, was a strategic necessity, and by any broader moral accounting, was something far more difficult to justify. One figure whose case drew particular attention was senior paramilitary officer Karl Wolff, not part of the Gehlen Organization directly, but part of the broader pattern of wartime figures who found shelter through intelligence relationships in the immediate post-war period. The lines between different American intelligence operations in occupied Germany were, in practice, often blurred. What the Gehlen case illustrated, and what the 2001 report stated plainly, was that the pressure of Cold War priorities systematically pushed questions of wartime accountability to the margins. The Nazi War Records Disclosure Act was passed in 1998. It forced the declassification of millions of pages of records held by U.S. intelligence agencies, records that had, for decades, remained sealed under national security classifications. What emerged over the following years was not a single dramatic confession. It was something more unsettling, a systematic paper trail showing how the bureaucratic machinery of American intelligence had, for years, handled information about the wartime conduct of the people it employed. In some cases, CIA records showed that background reports on Gehlen Organization personnel had flagged service in problematic wartime units, and that the flags had been acknowledged, and the individuals retained anyway. The reasoning, where it appeared in writing, consistently returned to the same logic: operational value, Soviet threat, no viable alternative. A 2006 report by the National Security Archive, drawing on the same declassified materials, concluded that U.S. intelligence agencies had employed at least 1,000 former Third Reich personnel in the early Cold War period across multiple programs, not only Gehlen's. The figure is disputed by some researchers who argue the definition of employed is too broad. Others argue the number is conservative. What is harder to dispute is the downstream consequence. The Gehlen Organization, operating under American oversight and later West German government authority, produced intelligence assessments on the Soviet Union that shaped Western strategic thinking for years. Some of those assessments, later analysts concluded, were significantly exaggerated, potentially because Gehlen's Soviet sources were less reliable than advertised, or in some cases had been turned. The organization that was justified on the basis of its irreplaceable intelligence value may have, in critical ways, provided intelligence that was shaped by the interests of the people providing it. There is a final detail that deserves to sit with you. Reinhard Gehlen retired in 1968 as the first president of the BND, the West German intelligence service, which he had built from the infrastructure of his wartime operation, funded by Americans who had recruited him from a holding facility in 1945. He died in 1979. He wrote a memoir. He gave interviews. He was never formally brought to account for anything. The men at Nuremberg had argued that there were acts for which there could be no strategic justification. The Gehlen case does not disprove that argument. But it does ask a harder question about who gets to decide when justification applies, and who bears the cost of that decision. We are still living with the institutions this arrangement built. The BND exists. The Cold War intelligence frameworks the Gehlen Organization helped shape still echo in how Western intelligence services understand Eastern Europe. The debate over what was gained and what was traded away has never fully closed. So here is the question worth sitting with. If a government possesses evidence of serious wartime conduct by someone it considers operationally essential, does the strategic calculus ever justify proceeding? And who bears the cost of that decision? If you have a perspective, the comment section exists for exactly this kind of conversation. And if this is the type of history you want to keep digging into, documented, archived, and then quietly buried, subscribing means we can keep pulling it back out.